Hello, this is Mike Swanson. You're listening to the Wall Street Window podcast. In a few moments, I'm going to have a very special guest. I'm going to be speaking with Larry Hancock, the author of the book In Denial, Secret Wars of Airstrikes and Tanks. This book just came out on Amazon.com. Now, we live in a world where over the past 2 weeks, the stock market has been rallying after it took a massive tumble. Actually was one of the quickest drops ever for the stock market off of a 52-week high. At one point, it was falling faster, in fact, than it did during the 1987 stock market crash and even the 1929 crash. But now we're rallying. I'm getting a lot of emails about that. And what I think is going on is that traders, whether they're humans, hedge funds, computer robots, are all betting on the future. In this sense, they're betting ahead of the moment in which the virus cases start to diminish, in which parts of the economy start to open up, in which the dire situation that we're in 2 weeks ago and still are in some parts of the country improves. Traders like to buy the rumor, sell the news. When it comes to stocks, if they know a company is going to have good earnings, there are people that will buy before that news and then sell. That's why often you'll see stocks gap up on earnings news and then drop. So this is essentially what is going on. I talked about in my private update 2 weeks ago how long I thought it would actually continue for. But people, are betting in a world of uncertainty. And we live in an interesting time. And that's what Larry Hancock's work sheds light on. He wrote a book called Creating Chaos, about covert warfare, how it's being waged by countries all over the world, how the United States waged it during the Cold War, but now other countries are using some of the techniques themselves. And his newest book, In Denial, is about secret wars, not just political wars or propaganda, but actual military operations. The most famous one, of course, was the Bay of Pigs invasion, which took place on April the 17th, 1961. So we now just passed a key anniversary date. But this is a fascinating book. It shows how in recent years, some countries such as China, Russia, and Iran have been more successful at their operations than the United States had been in the past, such as the Bay of Pigs operation. So what is going on here? What is this type of warfare really about? How did it start? Forget about James Bond movies. This is the real history. This is the real story. And I'm glad to be able to talk with Larry about it. So one quick commercial break, and then we'll be with Larry Hancock, author of In Denial, now available at Amazon.
Humans. Their nature demands competition, the rising tide of aggression shaping the world around us. Natural fear and disgust can overcome the ability to reason. Coping skills are left wanting. Carmine Savastano, Human Time Bomb, The Violence Within Our Nature, poses significant questions and considers the evidence that violence shapes the past and present. Human Time Bomb, The Violence Within Our Nature. Order your digital and print copies now on Amazon.com. For more information, visit tpaak.com. Carmine Savastano, Human Time Bomb.
Well, how you doing today, Larry?
I'm good. We had some really unusual weather. We had snow a couple of days ago, killed my tomato plants, but now it's looking like spring again, so I'm good.
Well, that's great. Well, actually, this week, a little tornado system came through where I live, woke me up like 5 in the morning. I got alerts and stuff but nothing bad happened, so that was kind of interesting. But we talked before last year about your book, Creating Chaos, about subtitles, Covert Political Warfare from Truman to Putin. Really a great book that helps explain a lot of the tactics various countries are using today, because they don't engage in big wars like World War II or World War I, those type of conflicts. But you just put out a new book titled In Denial. It's available on Amazon. Secret Wars with Airstrikes and Tanks is the subtitle. So what compelled you to write this after you wrote the other book?
Well, what really struck me was that in doing Creating Chaos and looking at political warfare, I saw a really major paradigm shift between what was happening during the Cold War and what was happening in contemporary political warfare, and the tactics that had been used for some 50 years following World War II, primarily by the United States in conducting political warfare during the Cold War, had shifted. And in contemporary times, the most prominent actors obviously are folks like the Russian Federation and Mr. Putin. And so in that book, I really tried to contrast and compare how political warfare had traditionally been conducted, and then map it out to how it had changed and how it was being conducted in this century, especially over the last few years, using the internet, using social networking, using the tools that are now available to do propaganda and disinformation and dirty tricks to a level that just had never been possible before. And so that made me think, has the same kind of shift happened in secret warfare? Do we still have it? What's going on now? How does it compare? And that's really gave me the stimulus to take a look at the longer term for covert action. And In Denial really addresses that question over a long span of time. During the Cold War, again, primarily looking at how the United States conducted secret warfare during the Cold War, and then shifting to how the more contemporary players like the Russian Federation, the Chinese government, and, for example, the Iranians are conducting quasi-secret warfare, disconnected warfare. It's still deniable, but as it turns out, it's again in a different paradigm than was occurring during the Cold War. And this is kind of a companion volume looking at how political war shifted in the 21st century, and In Denial is looking at how secret, deniable warfare has shifted in the 21st century.
Well, it's new. Many of the things that have happened in just the past 2 years, you mentioned Iran, for instance, but in my thinking, I guess, as a student of these type of topics, is that there's a lot of focus in the history about the United States. We had various covert operations in Laos and Africa in the 1970s. But the most famous one, in those operations, for the most part, they all end up failing. And you do a job in the book of talking about them. But the most famous operation, military or secret war type operation, is the U.S. war against Castro in Cuba, and the landing they tried at the Bay of Pigs. And you've put out what's really, and I've read several books about the Bay of Pigs, but what you've put out is up to now the most detailed description of what actually happened there, and why it didn't work out. But it seems like most of these things don't work out. Why do they fail so often?
Oh, they failed, especially for the United States, because the United States really approached them. Most often, they were oriented towards regime change, actually ousting a government that was in place that we felt was too nationalistic or too populist or too socialist. And basically, during the Cold War, especially during Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, uh, basically the attitude was that we weren't happy with neutrals. If you were a neutral, you were suspicious, and if you started doing, any trade with Eastern Bloc, or if you started doing agricultural reform, then you made us even more nervous. And then if you had anything to do with nationalizing American companies, that pushed it over the edge. So a, a lot of what we were doing around the globe during the Cold War was oriented towards regime change. So we were actually trying to use deniable measures to oust a regime in place. What's happening these days, and we can get back to that, one of the reasons it's changed is the current players are oriented towards something a little bit more directly related to them and their spheres of influence. So they're much more localized than what we were trying to do during the Cold War. The question as to why we had such little success is A, we were always going against an established government, which means most of those governments had military forces. They had conventional military forces. In some instances, they had quite well established military forces, and they were being supported by Russia and by the Eastern Bloc at the time. In the case of Cuba, by the time we really got our project going, it took us over a year, and we pretty much telegraphed our intentions. And by the time those landings kicked off, Cuba had really developed an extremely efficient security system. They received a lot of armaments and weaponry. As a matter of fact, for the Cuba project, the military commander of the landings, the amphibious landings, Colonel Hawkins, had told everyone involved that if we did not launch at the absolute last possible date that he had any chance of making the landings work were March 1st. Because if they fell beyond March 1st, the Cuba just would have been too much of a challenge. They were too well equipped, and it just wouldn't work. And unfortunately, the fellow who was the CIA officer who was in charge of the Cuba project basically ignored that, did not pass that information on, and of course, waited another 6 weeks beyond that deadline. And what happened was just exactly what Hawkins had predicted. The military leadership of the project had actually tried to resign before the landings occurred, telling their boss that it was just impossible. It was not going to work. And basically, he told them, if you resign, it'll be even worse. And he managed to convince them to stay on. And unfortunately, exactly what they predicted is what happened. But the larger answer to your question is, because we tried to do everything deniably. It's like we're involved with these revolutionaries, these surrogates. We tried to totally distance ourselves from it, and we spent huge amounts of time and money and energy trying to make it look like it was deniable, which when you start conducting airstrikes and using tanks, it's never going to be. We never did anything that everybody did not obviously understand we were supporting. And so when you put yourself in that kind of a situation, it's a catch-22. You have kind of fooled yourself. And if you go back and look at the people that were in charge of the operations afterwards, they would literally tell you that they were being asked to do something that just it wasn't going to work. Colonel Hawkins, in regard to the landings of the Bay of Pigs, came back and essentially said that basically they'd been asked to do something beyond the capabilities of a covert action, and this wasn't going to work. But of course, nobody paid any attention to it.
Well, with the Bay of Pigs landings, there's a lot of people were claiming that it was Kennedy's fault and he should have just done a lot of airstrikes and they could have succeeded. Do you think there's anything to that, or is that just doesn't make any sense?
That's been part of the problems about the Bay of Pigs, is that literally there was what I would call a false history generated for the action. And part of the false history is that the Bay of Pigs landings were the Cuba project, that was what it was all about, and it was an effort by Kennedy, and he didn't honor the commitments that he had made. And one of the problems is that storyline was actually spread by some of the officers that were involved, because they were told that by the head of the project, Mr. Bissell. In later years, actually only fairly recently, they were shown documents and materials and directives from the president, and they were amazed by the fact that they had essentially been lied to. What they had been told by their boss was literally not what Kennedy had agreed to, what Kennedy had directed. There's not any really good explanation for that, but because they were told something false, and they told that to everyone they were involved with, this false narrative involved. If you go back and look at the actual directive Kennedy issued for the operation, the only thing it talks about is landing a guerrilla force inside Cuba to help stimulate an insurgency. There's nothing that even suggests Kennedy knew that they were being landed with tanks. Talk about airstrikes. The strange thing is there was a lot made of the fact that they had to cover up the fact that the air attacks that were made were being backed by the United States, while at the same time the CIA was landing mainline American tanks on the beaches. The only place you could get those tanks was with the American Army. So how are you going to possibly cover up that this is not an American project?
Well, that seems to be a real problem all the time in these things, is how do you do a secret operation when you're using equipment that there's no way it can't be traced back if someone just looks at it?
And it's not the only time we did it. It really becomes it's sad and it's terrible, because lots of people get killed and lots of people get misled, and it's very sad in the end. But from a distance, you really look at it and say, how did you ever conceivably think that would be secret? An example, later on in Laos, I think we got to the point where we were conducting such conventional warfare in Laos that we were routinely sending B-52 strategic bombers into Laos on saturation bombing raids. And this was happening virtually right across the river from places in Thailand where people could see the bombing going on. And it's like, you're launching a major air war in this country and you expect it's going to say secret? And of course it didn't. But none of it really stays secret. It doesn't. But I would say one of the reasons I spend so much time on the Cuba project and the Bay of Pigs in the book is it is like the classic example of how one would attempt to organize something like this and why it would fail. I think one of the things, the other part of the misinformation about the Bay of Pigs is this was a project that started under President Eisenhower. He certainly never authorized anything like these amphibious landings. As a matter of fact, the project that he authorized was supposed to create an insurgency inside Cuba that would be will and play by October, November, before the elections where Kennedy was even elected by president. And as president, what happened was that part of the project totally failed. It just didn't happen at all. The CIA had to step back, and they did not even come up with this plan for an amphibious landing and presenting it to anybody before the end of the year, even in concept. And when they first took it to Kennedy, it wasn't even written down in any detail. So it's like everyone thinks of this as a Kennedy project. What it really was essentially a CIA fallback because the original project had failed months earlier.
Well, correct me if my understanding is wrong here, but am I right in thinking that the original project under Eisenhower, what it basically involved was trying to create or support a guerrilla movement inside Cuba by doing airdrops and giving them supplies, maybe even parachuting some men down there to assist, which is something that the CIA was trying to do in Tibet against China. It tried to do it in Eastern Europe, and also in Vietnam itself, and all these other places it failed. But am I correct in that's description of what they're doing?
Absolutely, it was very classic. It was actually they only took about 2 months, 2 to 3 months, when Eisenhower asked them to come up with a plan to oust Castro and oust the Castro regime. They only took a couple of months to come up with a plan because essentially what they did was to recycle an operation that they'd used successfully in Guatemala to oust a regime there. And it was very classic. You had propaganda element of it. You had political action element of it to organize, a surrogate government, a counter government, to organize the anti-Castro political factions. You needed to collect some intelligence. And then, yes, as you said, if you look at the plans, the whole plan was to train a relatively small, few dozen Cuban exiles, give them a lot of paramilitary training, and parachute them in or infiltrate them to work with resistance groups inside Cuba. And the assumption was always that there would be, a large resistance to Castro, and the project was essentially only enabling that insurgency. Now, what happened? That's what Eisenhower approved, and apparently, without Eisenhower knowing much in the way of details, a couple of months later, that was approved in March of 1960. By July, August, they were beginning to realize that it wasn't going to be nearly that easy, and they actually added a tactical plan to have airstrikes as they'd had in Guatemala. So they were going to put together a reasonably small, quote-unquote, guerrilla air force to conduct ground strikes in support of the insurgency, to drop supplies. So it changed a little bit then, but even up until November, there was nothing like this full brigade of 4 battalions and tanks and paratroops, the sort of thing that showed up at the actual landings in Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. That was non-existent.
So then they added that, I assume, then between the end of the election of Kennedy and then him coming into office.
Did. They actually proposed it. They first kind of proposed an outline of a plan for a landing force, proposed that to a special covert action oversight committee in December, discussed it with the National Security Council, not with Eisenhower necessarily, and, as an idea. But of course, these people are all outgoing. They're not going to be part of the Kennedy administration, but they had kind of seen what was happening and seen that wasn't the insurgency thing was just not working. So this was really, it was either this or declare war on Cuba and invade, full scale conventional warfare, declare war. So they kind of went with this approach. When Eisenhower found out about it, he wasn't really excited. What he said was, why don't you? He actually went to Bissell, the CIA head of the project, and said, well, maybe you should just stage some kind of provocation, like, get it to look like the Cubans are attacking us, and then I can send in the Army and Navy. And, but nothing like that was ever submitted to Eisenhower, nor was it submitted to Kennedy, although in the book, I have a chapter on hidden measures that looks very much like that plan may have been developed and actually been in play, and for various reasons it didn't work, along with some other actions that they had planned that didn't work. But Kennedy would have known nothing about that. One of the reasons it didn't work is that apparently they deployed a lot of explosives with the team actually infiltrating Cuba through Guantanamo Naval Base. And while they were getting ready and practicing with the explosives, most likely to simulate an attack on the base, they blew all the explosives up. And this just happened days before the landing.
I guess by accident?
By accident, yes. And I write about it in the book. This is something we've only learned about in the last few years. And so there were some things going in play that maybe might have helped it along. There are several projects to assassinate Castro. But again, Kennedy was told about none of that for whatever reason. One of the aspects of deniable operations is the CIA got very used to isolating the president to give the president political deniability. Well, that's one reason for doing covert action, is to give political deniability to the nation and to the president. But when you set off on those sorts of things, there are consequences.
Well, one thing I don't understand about all this is most of these operations don't work out, and the original Eisenhower, what was planned to drop, try to create a guerrilla do airdrops in this business. In Vietnam, the CIA tried to do that, and it didn't work there either. And in 1963, I've learned that in November they had this famous meeting at Honolulu in Hawaii, and the CIA person at that meeting told everyone there, including Robert McNamara, that these type of operations don't work, that if they it just won't work to try to support people in North Vietnam and create a guerrilla force, and when they send people up there and parachute them, they just get captured. And with the Bay of Pigs, they had hearings about it, why it failed, these Taylor Commission hearings, and they still kept trying to do these things in the years that followed. It's like they don't ever learn. What's going on?
I think what really goes on there, and in this case we have a little bit more detail, what really goes on is a country, I shouldn't say country, it's not really that way, a political leadership. The leadership of a given country encounters what they feel is a threat, but it's not a threat that they can respond to with conventional military force, or they don't want to respond to it with conventional military. They want an out. Basically, it's like, North Vietnam is a threat. What do I do about North Vietnam? I don't want to go into a land war in Southeast Asia. So the same thing would be Cuba. I don't really want it. engage myself fully, because that means I've got to declare war, and I don't want to do that. So what's my option? So always the option is, can we do this with secret warfare? Can we do it deniably with a mix of the things we just discussed? Propaganda, disinformation, setting up a insurgency, supplying it with weapons. Let's try that. Because that way it doesn't cost me thousands of lives. I don't get into a war. I don't get into a domestic political battle over it's like a temptation. This is like the classic temptation. How can I go to war and not go to war? And so that's the temptation is always there. Like, okay, I need to do something. There's even a political reason. People are pushing me to do something. I need to make it look like I'm doing something, but war's not on the table. I don't want to go there. The nation's not behind me to that extent. So we go to secret warfare. And we do that over and over again. And it's like, it doesn't matter. No matter if the last one failed or the next one failed, you continually go back and go, well, do I have an option? And in most cases, people don't want to tell a chief executive no. There are careers to be made, political points to be made. Somebody will always come back with a plan. Somebody will always come back with a program and a proposal. And the temptation is great enough, you get involved in it. The U.S. did it over and over again. It's happening again. Putin wanted the Ukraine. Putin wanted the Crimea. He didn't want to go to war against NATO. So he looked for a proposal and he got them. And I go into that in the book too. But this happens over and over again. And I think the problem is it very rarely works, but it works just enough. It's kind of like gambling, like intermittent reinforcement. It works just enough so that someone can always cite a case where it did work and somebody will gamble on it. It worked for the U.S. in Iran back in the 50s. It worked for the U.S. in Guatemala in the 50s. So, we'll try it in Cuba. We'll try it in North Vietnam. You mentioned a very interesting thing about that meeting in 1963. Certainly, we had been trying secret warfare and covert action against North Vietnam from the agreement that actually divided the two areas. And it's kind of strange there because we refused to sign on to the agreement because the agreement involved primarily the French, and it was going to let there be a vote as to, who would lead a consolidated free Vietnam. Well, we were afraid the Ho Chi Minh would win it, and so we just decided we didn't want to play that game. So we essentially set up a demarcation line, long story, bottom line. But by 1963, the CIA had been involved in covert action against the North for some years, and it was total disaster. What really happened is largely McNamara and some other advisors convinced Kennedy that was simply because the CIA wasn't competent enough, did not have the resources to do the level of covert military action that was required. So it's like, well, it's not the concept that's bad, it's just the CIA doesn't have the resources to go into as much military action as we need. And Kennedy said, okay, I'll accept that. McNamara pushed it. And they handed it over to the military in a project called Switchback. And they actually were switching covert action against the North from the CIA to the military, which gets really complex because the military didn't know how to do that. They had to go through their own learning process. And in the end, they didn't have any better luck than the CIA had. And in the end, what they were doing led us into the Tonkin Gulf. Long story there. But there's always the temptation. Well, maybe it will work. Maybe if we do it a different way, it will work. Maybe if we do it with the military rather than the CIA, it will work. So the long-winded answer to your question is, I think it's a matter of temptation and intermittent reinforcement.
Well, maybe even though I'm saying these things end up as disasters, and obviously the Bay of Pigs was a disaster, but perhaps the cost of that isn't that big for the leaders. So maybe that's why they, if I were to go out and get drunk every night, there would be terrible consequences. But maybe for this, it's not so bad for, that just comes, I don't know.
Well,
Maybe.
that's a very good point. I think if you look at it for the U.S. during the total Cold War period, it was the cost. It was always hugely expensive because we spent tons and tons of money trying to make it deniable. So it was expensive from a dollar standpoint, but the U.S. had lots of money. I mean, and in comparison to a conventional war or fielding a nuclear fighting force, it was inexpensive. Politically, it was not expensive because you weren't losing thousands of Americans. And in almost all these secret wars, you're using surrogates. You've created insurgency, so somebody else is getting killed. The Cuban, anti-Castro Cubans are getting killed at the Bay of Pigs. The Laotian Hmong people are getting killed by the tens of thousands in Laos. Vietnamese volunteers are getting parachuted into North Vietnam and killed. In Eastern Europe, we lost thousands of Eastern European volunteers after the war by parachuting them in, and they never came back. So it is inexpensive in terms of lives, which means politically, you're absolutely right. It's not expensive because it's not Americans dying in any noticeable quantity. And the same can be said in when we get into contemporary warfare. As long as you don't, declare war and have thousands, do mass mobilizations and have thousands of casualties, it's always relatively cheap, which does make it quite tempting.
Well, what about in recent years or today? Are the other countries are now doing it? Are they doing a better job? Are they having some of the same problems, or is it not achieving much for them either?
So let's look at the paradigm shift in the 21st century. The U.S. is really not doing either political warfare or secret warfare that much anymore because towards the end of the Cold War and in the 21st century, we've shifted to conventional military action. Right? We fight in Iraq, we fight in Afghanistan. We deploy huge conventional military forces and fight real battles, whether they're conventional forces battles like in Kuwait and Iraq during that war, or major counterinsurgency. So we've gone to conventional warfare. We're not trying to cover it up at all. Hugely expensive, lots of losses, and for whatever reason, we've managed to convince ourselves that that's okay, and we'll just keep doing it. And the shift has been towards these other players like the Russian Federation and President Putin and the Chinese, and they're taking quite a different approach. If you look at what Putin did in the Crimea, essentially he used deniable warfare, but he sent in his own military force, took over the Crimea, totally denied it while he was doing it, and overwhelmed Crimea with the Russian military. And after having said several times that there were no Russian military there, eventually, when it was successful, said, "Oh yeah, we did that. Those were our people," and even names the guards units that were involved. And initially, after having said, "Oh, we have no political designs on the Crimea," said, "Oh, yes, we do. We're going to incorporate it." And he just did it. I mean, just did it. And there was no military retaliation. It's kind of like the U.S. had just done it in Guatemala back in 1954, and he was successful in that. And it's like, okay, that didn't cost me much. It was hugely successful. This may be a new plan. So there were no surrogates. There was the Russian military. There was deniability, and then there wasn't. Clean, efficient, just do it. Of course, then he tried to use the same model in the eastern Ukraine, fragment the Ukraine, and essentially set up a separatist area, which he referred to as Nova Russia, New Russia. Long story there. That didn't work nearly as well. He used surrogate forces, volunteer forces, eventually large groups of Russian military that were denied. But he got into a quagmire in the Ukraine that you might very well compare to the United States and Laos. And so he got tempted by the Crimea. He got stuck in the Ukraine, but managed to pretty well politically cover himself. Then he came up with a brand new model. And the brand new model is a model that now he's used first in Syria, and he's now using in several other locations, including the Central African Republic, the Sudan, even Venezuela to some extent. And this was, it's a really interesting turn of events because he adopted the capitalist model. And basically, although the Russian Constitution disallows private commercial militaries, as president, he gave an exemption to that order and allowed some of his oligarchs to actually create large, very well armed private militaries. And he allowed Russian military personnel to go and serve in those militaries. And we saw that occur in Syria. And they played a major role in helping the Assad government in some of its initiatives in Syria. And the interesting thing was, in at least one conflict, the Russian commercial militaries, mercenaries, whatever you want to call them, the Wagner Group force, got actually engaged with U.S. forces and suffered some heavy losses, estimated several hundred. And then the question comes, well, how does that play? How do you not bear the political burden for that? And Putin's answer was, hey, that's not me. Go talk to the Wagner Group. Talk to the guys that run that. And no, we're not paying any death benefits. We're not going to bury anybody. That's their problem. And of course, when people went to talk to the Wagner Group, there were no answers. So basically, Putin has managed to come up, and he's doing the same thing in Central Africa and the Sudan, using a fantastic capitalist approach with these private armies, and it goes beyond that. They're not simply mercenaries. Yeah, they charge for their services in the Central African Republic and in the Sudan. They're charging big money for security services to those governments, but they're also cutting deals on the side that they'll only sign the security contract if the oligarch's other company, which is a commercial development company, gets a huge contract for their natural resources. So the one oligarch's getting paid for providing the security service. Another is starting a brand new business off access to the resources in the country involved. And it's a total win financially. So Putin is much more efficient at conducting secret warfare than the U.S. ever was during the Cold War.
Well, if we take your book, Creating Chaos, and combine it with this book, even though this book documents a lot of the past failures, it would seem some combination of all this is the future of warfare in the rest of this century. I would guess, and not, giant wars like Vietnam or even Iraq, what the United States did in the 2 Iraq wars. I don't know. What is
It,
that? What do you think?
is. It is, and it's pretty depressing. I would say it certainly gives us a model for what's going to go on for the next decade, maybe the next 20 years. But the thing about that is that would be kind of if we looked at the 1950s in the U.S. and we saw what the U.S. was doing and said, "Oh, look, they're using this secret warfare model. It worked for them in Iran. It worked for them in Guatemala. It looks like it might even be working in the early days in Laos, which it sort of was." And you go, well, this is going to be the model. This, which is what they thought, and they went ahead and, based on that, we got trapped into sort of an inertia, which said we kept doing it over it again when it was kept failing more and more repeatedly. Now, the question is, at the moment, Russia has been quite successful in Syria, in Crimea, unsuccessful in the Ukraine, largely. They're enjoying quite a bit of success in Central Africa and Sudan. Now, will that come back against them at some point? For example, in Central Africa, they are supporting a dictator. They're supporting a very brutal dictator, which unfortunately is what the U.S. ended up doing on occasion during the Cold War. And that didn't work out well in the long run. So when they're establishing these relationships with, national governments that are military dictatorships, that sort of thing can look good for a while, as it did for the United States and Latin America during the 1970s, and then it may go bad on you. Another example of this is that at the moment, Iran is being very successful using its quote unquote revolutionary guard and its surrogates in Yemen to conduct operations, sphere of influence operations in the Gulf. And they have disconnected them from this. The Iranian government will go, well, you guys conducted a missile strike on Saudi Arabia and took out their oil facilities. And they'll go, well, no, that wasn't us. And that was the Yemanis. We had nothing to do with it. Or, and at this point in time, they're getting away with it. They're getting away with it to the extent that they've seized several, tankers and boats. They've hindered commerce. They just seized another one yesterday, which was embarrassment because they happened to seize the Chinese freighter, and when they realized they got the wrong ship, they had to let it go. But that's working well for them. They've taken out American drones. They've conducted ballistic missile launches against American bases and injured American, and they suffered no consequences. So at the moment, you would have to say that model is working very well for them. How long does that work? I don't know, but I'm cautious by saying a lot of the things that the U.S. did at different periods of time during the Cold War looked like they were working for 5 years or for 10 years, and then the consequences overwhelmed them. And when they turned bad, they really turned bad quickly. So I think we want to take the lesson. I would not necessarily try to emulate what they're doing just because it's working for them now. Nor do I like the practices in general. I don't like their practices any more than I like our practices. But from a practical standpoint, I'm not going to endorse that they're going to continue to work, because we've seen that any type of secret warfare has its limits time-wise. And there are so many casualties of different types, whether they're social or, they may not be political casualties to the sponsor immediately, but you look at what we were doing. in Southeast Asia. Look at Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia, and look at Latin America, Central America. Look at everything that we did during the 60s and early 70s, and you see how badly that blew back on us by the end of that decade. You know, it took 5 or 10 years, but it fell apart.
Well, I would hope that Donald Trump or whoever the president is after him, whenever they're the president, will read your book so they'll resist the temptation to approve one of these sort of operations.
Maybe that should have been the title. It's like, don't be tempted. No. It really does work.
But no, I'm joking, but I'm also serious. But it's a great read, and I certainly recommend everyone listening to us talk about it. Go to Amazon and grab the book. It's an easy read too, very informative, and even if you think you know a lot about all the stuff, you'll learn something new. And if you don't know anything, or you feel like you don't, it's a great introduction to it. In fact, the introduction to your book is a great introduction to the setup of the entire national security state system. Should add that too. Well worth reading just to get that.
It really is a tutorial. I mean, there are people that follow this stuff and know what's going on that can jump right into it. But if you've not really studied it, most people, and strangely, I have talked to congressmen, I've talked to people in government, they really don't understand how all this works. Who has what authority? Who's allowed what classified access? Who has what oversight? The vast majority of the American public, including our congresspersons, really don't understand the system, which is quite frightening, because I will listen to them talk and say, well, why can't we do this or why can't we do that? And they should know. They should know how the system works, and they really don't. So it would be nice for them to read the tutorial too.
Well, when Trump got elected, the first couple weeks, there's some controversy because he was going to put Steve Bannon on the National Security Council. And in the press, there's controversy over that. But I remember seeing somewhere that they polled, maybe it was Congress people, but they polled a bunch of people, and they couldn't name who is on the National Security Council to start with. May not have even known what it does.
Yeah, right. And they certainly don't know. I mean, basically, there are 3 tiers. There are 4 tiers you have to worry about. You have the commander in chief, who's in charge of all these sorts of operations. You have the National Security Council, who's an advisor, who's under him and supposedly gives him advice. But under them, you have an oversight group for all covert activity, and there are representatives from his administration and from the military. They're the ones. They are supposed to know things and implement things and provide oversight. But below them, and this followed the crises of the 70s when we realized Congress had no part in any of this. There are committees in both the House and Senate. They're supposed to be briefed on this stuff. And unfortunately, that's not happening these days. We've come to the point where only certain senators are briefed, certain senators that like the administration, certain politicians. Congress as a whole doesn't get briefed. And this is an exact repeat of what happened during the late 1960s and early 70s, where Richard Nixon and Johnson didn't want the public to know what they were really doing. So they would go to the senators and congressmen who supported them, and they would tell them what they were doing, but not the rest of Congress. And so the tragic thing was then when we got essentially kicked out of both countries, these congressmen would come forth and go, well, you didn't tell us we were really in Laos. That's terrible. If I'd have known you were doing this, we would have stopped you. And then the CIA would come back and go, oh, here are our records. And the president actually had us brief this congressman. And actually, in the case of one leader, Mr. Symington, we took him to Vietnam, we took him to Laos, and we took him into the Hamon camp where we run all these covert operations. And that was pretty embarrassing because the week earlier he had said he knew nothing about any of it. So that sort of thing can go bad too.
Yeah, for sure. But, well, I've kept you a long time, so I'll let you go. And thanks for taking the time to talk with me and my listeners. And again, to recommend everyone grab the book, and hopefully we can do a follow-up interview sometime next couple weeks or so.
That would be great. I'm always ready. It's not necessarily a nice, friendly subject, but it's something that needs to be addressed.
Oh, it's absolutely fascinating too, especially the detail about the Bay of Pigs invasion. Well, I hope the weather gets a little better out there and everywhere else, and this virus goes away, and we'll talk again later.
Sounds good. I'll go plant some new tomato plants to replace the ones that got snowed on. Appreciate the conversation.
Thank you.